Crestwood, a small town tucked away in the rolling hills of West Virginia, had always prided itself on being a place where everyone knew everyone. The population hovered just above 2,000, and it was the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked at night, trusting in the quiet rhythms of daily life. The mornings were filled with the smell of freshly brewed coffee and the distant hum of trucks making their way down Main Street. Nothing truly significant had ever happened in Crestwood that was, until the summer of 2019. On the morning of July 14th, a suffocating stillness blanketed the town. A low fog clung to the ground, creeping between the trees and settling on the lawns like a warning. Ellie Carter, Crestwood's beloved librarian, was the first to notice something was off. She had lived in Crestwood her entire life, a pillar of the community. That morning, as she stepped out to grab her paper, she saw something strange across the street. The front door of the Stevens house stood ajar. Bill Stevens, the quiet mechanic, lived there with his teenage daughter, Leela. Ellie felt a knot of unease settle in her stomach. Bill was meticulous, never the type to leave a door open. She walked across the street and called his name from the front yard. No answer. She hesitated, then stepped closer. The air felt heavy. Something wasn't right. As Ellie peered into the dim hallway, her heart raced. The silence inside the house was more unsettling than any noise. Then she saw the unmistakable streak of something dark on the floor, trailing towards the kitchen. Ellie's breath caught in her throat. Her fingers trembled as she fumbled for her phone, dialing the sheriff's office. "Sheriff, it's Ellie," she whispered, her voice shaky. "Something's wrong at the Stevens house. You need to come. Now." Within minutes, Sheriff Jim Harding's cruiser pulled up, lights flashing but sirens silent, cutting through the early morning fog. Harding, a burly man in his 50s, with a reputation for keeping the peace in Crestwood, stepped out and immediately noticed Ellie's pale face. He followed her gaze to the open door, his hand instinctively moving to rest on his holster. "Stay here," he ordered, stepping into the house with measured caution. The moment he crossed the threshold, the faint metallic scent of blood hit him. Harding had been in law enforcement for over 2 decades, and he recognized the smell all too well. His eyes followed the dark smear on the hardwood floor, leading him deeper into the house. Each step seemed heavier than the last, the oppressive quiet pressing in on him. When he reached the kitchen, he stopped cold. Bill Stevens lay crumpled on the linoleum, a pool of blood congealing around his body. His face was a mess of bruises, his hands frozen in a defensive posture. But it wasn't just the beating that had killed him. A single, deep stab wound pierced his chest, directly through his heart. The knife, a large kitchen blade, was still lodged in the wound, its handle smeared with blood. Harding swallowed hard, forcing himself to look away. His mind raced as he considered the horrifying scene. But then he remembered Bill wasn't alone in this house. His daughter, Lila. "Lila?" Harding called out, his voice echoing through the house, but no answer came. Sheriff Harding's pulse quickened as he called Lila's name again, louder this time. Still, there was no reply. He took a deep breath, trying to suppress the rising sense of dread gnawing at him. If Bill Stevens was dead, then where was his daughter? The image of Lila's young face, just 16, with wide green eyes and a shy smile flashed in his mind. He moved quickly, his boots clomping across the blood-streaked kitchen floor, as he began searching the rest of the house. The living room was untouched, no signs of a struggle, no overturned furniture. Upstairs, Lila's bedroom door was slightly ajar, her bed neatly made, clothes still hanging in the closet. Everything in her room appeared normal, except for one chilling detail. Her cell phone was lying on the bedside table, the screen cracked. Harding picked it up, scrolling through the last few messages. Most were harmless texts between friends, but the last one, sent just after midnight, caught his eye. It was from Leela to her best friend, "Haley can't sleep. He's acting weird again." He stared at the message, trying to decipher its meaning. Who was he? Was she talking about Bill or someone else? There were no further texts after that. Harding felt a knot form in his stomach. He pocketed the phone and hurried back downstairs, stopping just long enough to radio his deputy, Ray McCall. "We've got a situation over at the Stevens place," Harding said, his voice tense. "Bill's dead. Lila's missing. I need you here right away. And call the state police, we might need more manpower." As Harding stepped back outside, Ellie Carter was still standing in the yard, her hands clasped tightly together. Her eyes widened when she saw the grim look on the sheriff's face. "Is he?" she asked softly, her voice trembling. Harding nodded. "Bill's gone. And Leela, she's not here." Ellie gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Oh my God, Lila, where could she be? She'd never just run off like this." "I don't know, but we're going to find her," Harding said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. As the fog continued to lift from the ground, the once peaceful town of Crestwood began to feel more like a trap. Somewhere out there, Lila Stevens was either running for her life or worse, she had already met the same fate as her father. So by mid-morning, Crestwood was buzzing with the news. A murder in their quiet town, Bill Stevens, of all people. And Lila missing. Harding had sealed off the Stevens home with crime scene tape, and state police were swarming the area, scouring for any clues that might lead them to the girl. Neighbors gathered in small groups, whispering about what might have happened, their faces pale with shock. At the sheriff's office, Harding sat at his desk, staring at the coroner's preliminary report. Cause of death, a single stab wound to the chest. Time of death, between midnight and 2 a.m. The brutality of the crime disturbed him. But what bothered him more was the unknown who could have done this. And why? And there were no signs of forced entry, no robbery. Bill Stevens wasn't the kind of man to have enemies. And then there was Lila's cryptic message. He's acting weird again. Whoever he was, Harding couldn't shake the feeling that it was the key to unraveling the case. Just then, the door swung open, and Deputy Ray McCall stepped in, his expression grim. "Sheriff, we found something down by the riverbank. You're going to want to see this." And Harding's heart skipped a beat. The riverbank, just a mile from the Stevens home, was a favorite hangout for teenagers in town. But he grabbed his hat and followed McCall outside, where his cruiser was waiting. As they drove through the winding roads, Harding felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. Every minute that passed without finding Lila alive was another minute closer to a potential tragedy. When they arrived at the riverbank, a few state troopers were already on the scene, combing the area with flashlights, despite the growing daylight. One of them waved Harding over, pointing toward a patch of mud near the water's edge. Harding crouched down, squinting at the ground. There, half buried in the mud, was a shoe, a small, white sneaker. McCall knelt beside him, his voice low. "That's Lila's, Sheriff. Matches the description from her friends." Harding's jaw tightened. "Anything else?" McCall nodded and motioned to a narrow trail leading into the woods. "We found footprints, too. They lead deeper into the forest. But there's something else. Looks like they're not alone. We've got 2 sets of prints. One smaller, probably Lila's, and one bigger, likely a man." Harding felt a chill crawl up his spine. Lila hadn't just run away. She'd been taken. The discovery of the footprints sent a jolt of urgency through Sheriff Harding. Crestwood was surrounded by dense forests, with miles of untouched wilderness stretching beyond the town's borders. If Lila had been dragged into those woods, finding her would be like searching for a needle in a haystack. Harding and McCall followed the trail into the trees, the thick canopy above blocking most of the sunlight. The forest was eerily quiet, the only sound being the crunch of leaves underfoot. The air felt cooler, more oppressive as they ventured deeper. Every few feet, Harding stopped to examine the ground, the 2 sets of footprints winding deeper into the wilderness. Whoever had taken Lila had known these woods well, avoiding the obvious paths in favor of more concealed trails. After nearly an hour of tracking, they came upon a small clearing. There, in the middle, was something that made Harding's blood run cold, an abandoned backpack. It was pale blue, dirtied by the forest floor, and unmistakably Lila's. Her initials LS were embroidered on the side, a gift from her mother before she passed. Harding knelt down, picking up the bag and unzipping it slowly. Inside he found a few crumpled notebooks, some pens, and a half-empty bottle of water. No phone, no sign of anything out of place except the location. His mind raced as he looked around the clearing. Why leave the backpack? Was the kidnapper taunting them, or had something scared them off before they could go any further? Suddenly, a rustling noise echoed from behind a nearby cluster of trees. Harding shot up, drawing his weapon, McCall doing the same. Both men stood still, listening, eyes scanning the dense brush. Then, from behind the trees, a figure emerged, disheveled and breathing heavily. "Hold it right there." Harding barked, his gun trained on the figure. The man stepped into the clearing, hands raised in the air. He was tall and wiry, with unkempt hair and dirt-streaked clothes. His face was gaunt, eyes wild with fear or paranoia. Harding recognized him immediately. Frankie Calloway, a local drifter who lived in the outskirts of town, often wandering through the woods and surviving off odd jobs. Frankie had always been a bit of an outcast, mostly harmless, but the timing of his appearance couldn't be ignored. "What the hell are you doing out here, Frankie?" Harding demanded, lowering his gun but keeping it ready. "Did you see anything? You better start talking." Frankie's eyes darted between the sheriff and the backpack. He took a step back, his voice shaky. I didn't do nothing, Sheriff, I swear. I was just walking through the woods like I always do, minding my own business. Then I saw her." Harding's heart skipped a beat. "Saw who? Lila? Where?" Frankie nodded, his whole body trembling. The girl, she was running, looked scared out of her mind. She was running toward the old mine, just past the creek. McCall exchanged a glance with Harding. The old mine had been abandoned for years, a relic of Crestwood's long-forgotten coal industry. It was dangerous, unstable, and the perfect place for someone to hide or worse. "Did you see anyone with her?" Harding pressed, stepping closer. Frankie hesitated, then shook his head. "No, just the girl. I didn't stick around after that. I don't want to get blamed for nothing. Please, Sheriff, you gotta believe me." But Harding didn't have time to sort through Frankie's story. Whether he was telling the truth or not, Lila could be in serious danger. The mine was about a mile away, but getting there meant crossing rough terrain, so there was no time to waste. "Go back to town, Frankie, and if I find out you're lying, I'll be coming for you," Harding warned, turning toward McCall. "Let's go. We're heading for the mine." The trail leading to the abandoned mine was steep and treacherous, forcing Harding and McCall to move carefully but quickly. The mine, once a symbol of Crestwood's brief industrial boom, had been closed for decades after a collapse left it too dangerous to work in. Now, it was little more than a crumbling ruin, hidden deep in the forest, its entrance partially covered by overgrown vines and debris. As they approached, Harding's breath quickened. The mine loomed ahead like a dark mouth, waiting to swallow them whole. He hadn't been out here in years, and even in broad daylight, the place gave him an uneasy feeling, but there was no turning back now. "We'll go in slow," Harding whispered, motioning for McCall to follow his lead. "Stay sharp. We don't know who or what might be in there." The inside of the mine was even darker than Harding had imagined. He pulled out a flashlight, a beam slicing through the dust-filled air. The walls were damp, the floor uneven, littered with old rusted tools and wooden beams that looked ready to collapse at any moment. As they moved deeper into the tunnel, Harding strained to listen for any sound, anything that might indicate Lila was close. The faint drip of water echoed in the distance, but other than that, there was nothing. No voices, no movement. Then, just as they rounded a bend, McCall grabbed Harding's arm, his voice low. "Look." On the ground ahead of them was another shoe, identical to the one they'd found at the riverbank. Lila had definitely been here. Harding's pulse quickened as they pushed forward, the tunnel narrowing the further they went. Suddenly, they heard a soft, muffled sound, almost like a cry. Harding stopped in his tracks, raising a hand for silence. The noise was coming from deeper inside the mine. Lila was alive. Harding motioned for McCall to cover him as they moved toward the sound. As they rounded a final corner, the flashlight beam caught a glimpse of something that made both men freeze. Lila Stevens was there, tied up, her eyes wide with fear. And standing over her, with a knife in hand, was someone Harding never expected to see. The beam from Harding's flashlight flickered over the figure standing above Lila. The man's back was turned, but his posture was rigid, shoulders tense, as if caught in a moment of indecision. Lila, bound at the wrists and ankles, lay on the cold, uneven ground, her wide eyes pleading silently with the sheriff. Harding's pulse thundered in his ears as he aimed his gun at the man, his voice cutting through the thick air like a blade. "Turn around, now." The man hesitated for a moment before slowly turning to face them, the dull gleam of the knife in his hand catching the light. As his face came into view, Harding felt a cold shock of disbelief. It was Sam Harrison. Sam, the high school history teacher, a respected figure in the community, had been one of the last people Harding would have suspected. He was known for his gentle demeanor, a mentor to countless kids in Crestwood, including Lila. Sam had even attended town meetings to speak about safety concerns for local teens. The betrayal stung harder because of how closely Sam had been woven into the fabric of the town's life. "Sam?" Harding's voice was barely above a whisper. "What the hell are you doing?" Sam's face was pale, his eyes darting between Harding and McCall. There was no anger, no malice in his expression, just a twisted kind of desperation. His grip tightened on the knife, but his hand trembled. "I didn't want to do this," Sam muttered, his voice cracking. "It wasn't supposed to go this far." "Put the knife down," Harding said, his voice calm but firm, trying to keep the situation from spiraling out of control. "We can figure this out, but you've got to let her go. Whatever's happened, we can still fix this." Sam shook his head, his eyes wide with panic. "You don't understand. No one understands." "Then explain it to me," Harding said, taking a small step forward. "Why are you here? Why did you take Lila?" For a brief moment, the tension in Sam's face softened, and he glanced down at Lila, as if seeing her for the first time. His grip on the knife loosened, but he didn't let go. His voice wavered as he spoke. "It was never about Lila. It was about Bill. He found out," Sam said, his words tumbling out like a confession. "About us. He was going to expose everything. My career, my life, it would have been over." Harding's eyes narrowed. "Found out about what, Sam?" Sam's face twisted with a mixture of shame and defiance. Lila and I didn't mean for it to happen, but it did. Bill found out a few weeks ago. He came to my house, threatened to go to the police, to the school board. I tried to reason with him, but he wouldn't listen. So I went to talk to him that night, to make him understand, but things got out of hand. That he attacked me first, I swear it. I didn't mean to kill him. Harding's mind raced, the pieces of the puzzle finally snapping into place. Bill had discovered the inappropriate relationship between his daughter and her teacher. When he confronted Sam, it had turned deadly. Sam had stabbed Bill in a fit of panic, and then, in his desperation, taken Lila, thinking he could somehow fix the mess he had created. I put the knife down, Sam, Harding repeated, his voice now cold with disgust. It's over. For a moment, Sam looked as if he might comply. He stared down at the knife in his hand, his shoulders slumping, as though the weight of his actions had finally crushed him. But then his eyes flicked back to Lila, and a shadow of something darker crossed his face. No, he whispered, shaking his head. I can't go to prison, I won't. Before Harding could react, Sam lunged forward, the knife raised. The moment seemed to stretch in slow motion as Harding fired his weapon, the crack of the gunshot echoing through the mine like a thunderclap. Sam's body jerked violently, and he crumpled to the ground, the knife clattering away from his limp hand. Harding rushed forward, kicking the knife out of reach before kneeling next to Sam's body. The blood was already pooling beneath him, the bullet wound in his chest gushing dark and fast. Sam's eyes fluttered open for a brief second, filled with the last flicker of life, before they closed for good. The mine was silent except for the shallow, ragged breaths of Lila, still bound and terrified. McCall hurried over, kneeling beside her to untie her wrists and ankles. The moment she was free, she scrambled away from Sam's lifeless body, curling into herself, as the weight of the last 24 hours seemed to crash down on her. Harding holstered his weapon, his hands still shaking as he crouched beside Lila. It's okay. It's over now. You're safe, he murmured, trying to reassure her, but the words felt hollow. Lila didn't respond, her eyes fixed on Sam's body, her face ashen. For her, this nightmare wouldn't be over for a long time. Harding glanced over at McCall, who was already on his radio, calling for backup and an ambulance. They'd need more than just medical help. Lila would need a lot of support to recover from the trauma Sam had inflicted, physically and emotionally. Within an hour, the once abandoned mine was swarming with law enforcement, paramedics, and town officials. The scene was chaotic, flashing lights illuminating the dark entrances. Investigators and forensic teams combed through the area. The small town of Crestwood had been shaken to its core by the revelations of that day, the truth about a trusted teacher, and the horrific crime that had followed. As Harding watched Lila being led to the waiting ambulance, wrapped in a blanket and flanked by a female officer, he couldn't shake the overwhelming feeling of failure. He had known Sam Harrison for years, trusted him. How could he have missed the signs? How many other secrets were hidden in the shadows of this quiet town, waiting to be uncovered? McCall stepped up beside him, his face pale and tired. Hell of a day, Sheriff. Yeah, Harding muttered, his eyes still fixed on the ambulance. And Crestwood won't be the same after this. The days that followed were a blur of media coverage, grief, and a town trying to grapple with the dark truth that had been hiding in plain sight. Reporters flooded Crestwood, turning the small town into a spectacle. Headlines about the murder of Bill Stevens and the abduction of Lila splashed across every screen and paper, tarnishing the image of a place once known for its tranquility. The investigation revealed more than Harding had anticipated. Interviews with Lila's friends painted a clearer picture of her relationship with Sam Harrison. There what had seemed to be a mentorship had slowly crossed lines that Sam had no right to cross. Lila, too young to fully grasp the manipulation, had been lured into a toxic bond she didn't know how to escape. Bill Stevens had realized what was happening too late and paid the ultimate price for trying to protect his daughter. The town mourned Bill, a father who had simply wanted to protect his child. His funeral was a somber affair, the grief palpable as people gathered to pay their respects. Harding stood at the back, his hat in his hands, wondering how a town so small could hold such deep secrets. Months passed, the scars left by the events of that summer remained fresh. Lila was moved to live with her aunt in a neighboring state, far from the memories that haunted her in Crestwood. The trial for Sam Harrison never came as death had ensured, but his legacy of deceit and manipulation lingered like a shadow over the town. For Harding, the case was far from over in his mind. He spent sleepless nights replaying every moment, questioning how someone like Sam could have evaded suspicion for so long. He had looked evil in the face that day in the mine, but it hadn't worn the mask of a stranger. It had looked familiar, friendly even. That was what haunted him the most. Crestwood slowly returned to its quiet ways, but the air was different now, heavier with the knowledge that even the most peaceful places could harbor darkness. People locked their doors at night, no longer trusting the idyllic safety they had once taken for granted. The town would heal, as all towns do, but some things Harding knew would never be the same. As for him, the shadows of Crestwood would remain, lingering just out of sight, a constant reminder that evil often wears a friendly face. As spring deepened into summer, the weight of what had happened in Crestwood still hung in the air. Though the town tried to return to normal, there were invisible cracks, places where the fabric of trust had been torn and couldn't be mended. Lila's absence was felt by everyone, but none more than Sheriff Jim Harding. He couldn't escape the gnawing guilt that lived inside him, whispering that he should have seen the signs, should have protected her better. It had been months since the murder and Lila's abduction, but Harding still saw her face and his dreams haunted, terrified. He remembered the trembling in her voice when he had found her in the mine, bound and broken. Though Sam Harrison was dead, his shadow lingered, infecting every corner of Crestwood with the memory of his crimes. One night, Harding found himself driving down the old road that led to the Stevens house. It had been abandoned since Bill's death. The house, once a warm, welcoming place, now stood like a tombstone, silent and forgotten. No one wanted to buy it, and the town council had left it untouched, a painful reminder of everything that had gone wrong. He parked his cruiser by the curb, staring at the dark windows. Inside, he could picture the blood-stained floor, the kitchen where Bill Stevens had been murdered. The image had been seared into his mind since that morning. Bill's lifeless body, Lila's small frame missing. Harding had dealt with death before, but nothing like this. This case had broken something inside of him. He climbed out of the car, stepping onto the gravel driveway, gravel crunching beneath his boots. There was something he needed to do here, closure, maybe. Or maybe just to face the ghosts that had been following him for months. As he reached the front porch, he noticed something odd. The door, which had been locked by the crime scene investigators, was slightly ajar. His hand instinctively moved to the holster at his side, but he didn't draw the gun. He pushed the door open slowly and stepped inside. The house was dark, but moonlight filtered through the cracked windows, casting long shadows across the floor. Everything was still, but there, on the kitchen table, something caught his eye. A letter. It was plain, an envelope folded neatly, with no address. A chill crawled up his spine as he reached for it, recognizing the familiar scrawl of Lila Stevens on the front. Harding opened it slowly, his heart pounding as he unfolded the letter. Inside, Lila's handwriting was shaky, as if she had written it in haste. Sheriff Harding, I don't know if you'll ever read this. I'm not coming back to Crestwood. Too many bad memories, too much pain. But I wanted you to know something. I didn't want to believe it at first. I couldn't, but I knew. Deep down, I knew what Sam was doing was wrong. He kept telling me that I couldn't tell anyone, that no one would believe me. When my dad found out, I thought he would fix everything, but it was too late. It's not your fault. I know you did everything you could, but I can't live in Crestwood anymore. Not with everything that happened. I just need to move on. Thank you for saving me. The letter was brief, but each word felt like a weight being lifted from Harding's chest. Lila was alive, and she was trying to rebuild her life. But there was also something else in her words, something darker. She had known. Maybe not consciously, maybe not clearly, but on some level, she had known what Sam Harrison was doing was wrong. And yet, the manipulation had been too powerful, the control too deep. But Harding folded the letter and slipped it into his pocket. He didn't know if he would ever truly forgive himself for what had happened, but Lila's words gave him a small piece of solace. She didn't blame him. The town, however, still felt different, and he knew there would be no real closure, not for him, not for Lila, not for the people of Crestwood. Sam Harrison's crimes had left a scar too deep to heal completely. The next morning, Harding sat at his desk, Lila's letter folded neatly beside him. The investigation had officially been closed for months, but it never truly felt finished. Today, though, he would try to end it, at least in his mind. He reviewed the final case report one last time, going over every detail. Bill Stevens' murder had been brutal, but it was clear that Sam had acted out of desperation. The autopsy showed that Bill had fought back, likely discovering Sam's secret relationship with his daughter just days before his death. Lila had been caught in the middle, manipulated by the very man who was supposed to be her protector and teacher. The town had started moving forward, but it wasn't easy. The school had hired new counselors, and the town council had implemented new policies for student-teacher interactions, trying to prevent another tragedy like this. But trust was hard to rebuild, especially after something like this. Harding closed the file and leaned back in his chair, staring out the window of his small office. The town was quiet this time of year. Summer was just starting, the heat settling over the streets like a blanket. The sheriff had been here for more than 20 years, but now, for the first time, he wasn't sure if he belonged. A knock at the door broke his thoughts. Deputy Ray McCall stepped in, his usual easygoing demeanor replaced by something more somber. "You all right, Sheriff?" McCall asked, glancing at the letter on the desk. "You've been quiet lately." Harding nodded, though he wasn't sure if he was all right. Just thinking about everything, about what happened, about Lila. McCall pulled up a chair, sitting across from him. "You did everything you could, Jim. Sometimes there's no stopping people like Sam. He hid it well. Too well." "I know," Harding said, though the words still felt hollow. "But it doesn't change what happened." "No," McCall agreed. "But maybe it's time to let it go. Lila's trying to move on. Maybe you should too." Harding looked down at the letter one last time, then carefully placed it in a drawer, locking it away. McCall was right. The case was over. Crestwood would heal in its own way, but it wouldn't be the same. It never could be. As Harding stood, pulling on his jacket, he glanced out the window at the familiar streets of the town he had sworn to protect. He had spent his life keeping Crestwood safe. But some evils couldn't be stopped until it was too late. "Come on," Harding said, clapping McCall on the shoulder. "Let's go grab some coffee." And as they stepped out into the warm summer sun, Harding took a deep breath. The weight of the past year still clung to him, but for the first time in months, it felt a little lighter. Crestwood would carry the scars of Sam Harrison's betrayal, but life would go on, and so would he. For the shadows of Crestwood were still there, but now, Harding knew they couldn't consume him. Not anymore.